and that the recording is live now. And as we go through the evening, we're going to have some background information. We're going to have a chance for you all, you'll be delighted to know, to practice with others here on how you might talk to one of your TDs, and we'll be talking about the next steps after that and the things that are coming up, the opportunities the supports we're going to have in place to help you have those conversations individually or indeed in groups if you want to over the next. Really, we're only talking about 4 or 5 weeks. The minister is due to go to the COP in about, I think it's 5 weeks from today, to the UN climate talks in Egypt, and their plan is to have the new climate action plan out before then. The energy security review and the energy poverty action plan might take a little bit longer, but the climate action plan will be done before then. So look, you're all very welcome. Thank you so much for giving your time. You know, it's everyone has busy lives, and it's good to join us on a Tuesday evening at 7:30. We're very grateful. And so I'm going to hand you over now to Breed, who will really introduce a bit and say a bit more about the actual of the policy context we're in now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening. The purpose of this session is to set the scene for bold, fast, and fair climate action, and to give you the tools that you need to feel comfortable to talk to your TDs about climate action. We'll also cover the supports that we'll have in place over the next 4 to 5 weeks to help you have those conversations either individually or in maybe small groups. Now, the minister is to go to the COP, so the UN climate talks that will take place in Egypt. He's due to go in about 5 weeks to that. And their plan is that they will have the Climate Action Plan 2023 out before then. Now, there are other 2 big things that are coming up over the next few months. The first is the Energy Security Review. Now, the consultation is open for this at the moment, and I'll talk about that later on in the presentation. And also the updated energy poverty strategy is due. This has been overdue with a few years now. The consultation has closed on it, and this is also expected to be released in the coming months. But they are likely to take a bit longer and will be released a bit later than the Climate Action Plan. All right. So there are 3, if I can go forward, there are 3 energy challenges facing us as we head into this winter. An energy crisis of supply, affordability, and pollution. Now, the overall solution to these 3 problems, which you can see here on the slide, and the best way to protect households and communities across Ireland is one and the same, and that is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels as quickly as we can. All right, so we'll start with energy security then. You can see 2 maps here. The map on the left, it shows that Ireland is relatively sheltered from supply risk in terms of the imports of Russian gas as compared to other European countries such as Germany, the Netherlands, Italy. In the German case, I think they get about 60% of their gas from Russia. And on average across the EU, then that number is about 40% of gas that comes from Russia. So as I said, in our case, in the Irish case, we are relatively sheltered from this as compared to other EU countries. Now, this is also the case despite being at the end of Europe's gas pipelines. We do have a very low reliance on Russian gas. Now, here in Ireland, we get about 25% of our gas from domestic sources, and the rest comes from the UK. In the UK, about half is produced domestically, and the other half is imported. And of that imported gas, over 70% of that comes from Norway, so from the Norwegian continental shelf. Okay. Now, in very positive news, solar is now the cheapest electricity in human history. And we've seen this tipping point in wind and solar technologies far beyond what people thought was possible 20 years ago. You know, we've seen these massive drops in the cost of both over the past 10 years. Now, you'll remember over the summer, the heat waves and the droughts that hit us in Europe. They impacted everything from food supply to transport to the environment. In Italy, I think the River Po, it fell 2 meters below its normal levels, and the River Rhine, it became so shallow that cargo vessels couldn't pass through it fully loaded. France saw rivers dried up and covered in, and littered in dead fish. So There were significant biodiversity impacts to this, but the droughts also impacted hydropower production, which fell about 20% in the first half of this year as compared to the previous year. This is in part linked to the reservoirs drying up in places like Italy and Norway, for example. Now, nuclear power production has also fallen this year as compared to 2021. One reason for this is that France has had to shut down several of its nuclear power plants for a few key reasons. One is that the rivers that have been used to cool down the reactors are now just too warm, or were too warm over the summer. France is 70% dependent on nuclear energy and is also a key exporter of electricity to other countries such as Germany or Italy. And now it's not just that the rivers are warmer, that's not the only problem. Many of the nuclear power plants have also been experiencing some maintenance issues. Maintenance have been delayed because of the pandemic. And all of this has meant that nuclear output was down about 50%. But that power, then they have to get that power from somewhere else. So they've also ramped up their imports of power from other European countries, whose power systems are also under a bit of strain at the moment. On the coal side of things, we've also seen that Europe's coal imports jumped about 35% in the first half of this year as compared to the year before. So this is being used, obviously, then they're ramping up the coal-fired power stations to displace the use of imported gas from Russia in particular. Okay. Now, the Irish government recently launched in a consultation on energy security. This will close on the 28th of October, and we would encourage you to submit to the consultation. Now, Friends of the Earth will be hosting a webinar on October the 17th, and there will also be an e-action to follow this, so you will be supported to submit to that consultation. Now, energy security, it's all about balancing supply and demand to ensure that we have this uninterrupted supply of energy at an affordable price. Now, the consultation then, it's looking for views on policy measures. So what can we do? What can we implement? What can the government implement to make sure that our energy supply is secure? So as part of the consultation, then the government commissioned a group of technical consultants to assess different measures that could support energy security on the one hand, but while also cutting emissions on the other. Now, it ruled out several options. So it actually ruled out, or the technical report ruled out an LNG import terminal on land that is either commercially owned or state owned. It also ruled out a commercially operated floating LNG terminal. It actually only shortlisted 2 possible gas infrastructure options, and both of which are temporary and limited to prevent gas lock-in. And that is a floating LNG terminal that will be operated as a backup facility only, so rather than a commercial enterprise. So that's the first one. And then the second one would be a state-backed gas storage facility, which could be operated as a backup measure as well. Okay, so we'll go forward. Well, before I go forward, there were a few viable options put forward by this report, and those were green hydrogen as an option, demand response, so increasing that flexibility on the power system, more interconnection to other countries, for example, so that we can import and export electricity, and more storage. Storage for wind power, storage for solar will be key going forward. So those were things that they suggest emphasis should be placed on those key options. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the second challenge then. This is affordability and the issue of energy poverty and the energy price crisis. So with the recent electricity price increases, about 40%, it's estimated now, of Irish households are living in energy poverty. This is the highest rate ever recorded. Now, average household energy bills have increased by about €1,100 in 1 year, although the reports now this might be closer to 2,000. This situation has the potential to deteriorate even further in the coming winter. Now, what's important to point out is that the rising costs of energy, they disproportionately impact those that are vulnerable and those that are on lower incomes. Now, speaking of electricity prices, like the current prices are unprecedented. Like the rises and falls of the electricity prices generally follow the gas price quite closely. Now, I've put a little orange box in here on this slide, and you can see the impact of this is the post-COVID sort of bounce back. The economy started opening up. There was greater demand for fossil gas. you can see the price starting to go up. A few months later then, in April 2021, Europe was hit by a very cold period of weather. It meant we were using more gas, and then we had less in storage. We would normally start storing gas in the spring. The summer then, summer 2021, it brought intense heat waves across the world, in Canada, the US, but also in Asia. And there was a greater demand for air conditioning. And then this led to LNG being diverted from Europe to Asia, and again impacting price. Now, coming into the winter months, the winter 2021, gas storage was lower than normal in Europe, and again the price continued to rise. And then Russia invaded Ukraine in February, and that drove oil and gas prices even further northwards. And now everything we have experienced this year, and in particular, this year in particular, it highlights the dangers of our fossil fuel dependence. Ireland is now being impacted by the most significant energy shock since the 1970s oil crisis. We're exposed to volatile gas markets that are driving record energy price increases and hurting lower income households in particular, though I think everybody is feeling it. And all of this then is worsened by the cost of living crisis. So we need rapid decarbonisation, and we need it quickly. Okay, so in response to these challenges, Friends of the Earth, it released a 5-point plan to cut bills, save energy and reduce pollution back in May. And as well as that, a joint statement with 42 civil society organisations calling for the government to put forward measures on energy efficiency, cost of living and energy poverty. Now, addressing the barriers to, it's crucial if we are to meet our targets and to get Irish households in particular off expensive and polluting fossil fuels for heating and towards sustainable alternatives that will bring warmer homes and lower bills over time. Now, the 5-point plan, there were 5 key asks, but there were many asks within each of these categories. So the first was that people need help with energy bills, especially those that are in fuel poverty or those that are struggling with their bills. The second related to home energy savings, right? So we should be insulating 100,000 homes, again targeting those that are at risk of energy poverty. The third key point related to prioritizing community energy, right? So driving public participation, placing people at the center of the energy transition, with a solar PV rooftop revolution, we call it. Now, Friends of the Earth has been calling for this for a long time, and the government has recently now changed the planning regulations around this so that the restrictions on the amount of solar PV you could have on your roof have been lifted. They've also now committed to every school in the country having solar PV on their rooftop. So this is a very positive move that we are very happy about. The third one then is all about reducing car dependence, especially for children to get to school without their parents using a car or parent using a car. So that's important. It's about more public transportation, better public transportation, more abilities and opportunities for active travel. And the last one then is just getting off fossil fuels, planning and investing to end our dependence on them as quickly as we can. Okay, I've included the links here to both of those at the bottom of the slide, so you can access them if you want to read more about that. All right. So moving on to the third challenge then, and this is to do with the fact that we need fast and bold climate action. The time for incremental change and sort of baby steps in the right direction is now over. We need bold climate action. All right, so emissions continue to rise year on year, and temperature change tracks GHG emissions. You can see that in the visualization at the bottom of the slide here. Concentrations recently passed, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere recently passed 420 parts per million volume for the first time, and are now more than 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. Carbon dioxide is at a level that our species has never experienced before. This is not news. We've known about this for the bones of 50 years. The picture on the right is from the IPCC 1.5 degree report. It shows the cuts that are needed for us to get to net zero globally. So this is globally by either 2040 or 2055. Now the gray line you'll see here is slightly less steep than the blue line. So the blue line is if we reduce our emissions now. right? We don't wait until the future to try and clean up the pollution or draw down the carbon dioxide using technologies that don't yet exist at scale. The grey line then, it assumes an overshoot and then a correction, or we do clean that up later, or we draw down that carbon from the atmosphere later. So either we reduce now, change the world for the better, or we sort of fumble along and don't fix the underlying issues and then hope that we can clean it up. Hope that we can clean it up later. Okay. Now go forward. Now this visual, it shows the risks of 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. Now the dark bars in the middle, so those green, we can point them out here, the green bars here in the center, this shows the level of risk at the current time, current day as we sit here today. This is the level of risk. This one, the kind of grey bar, I guess you call it, this shows the level of risk under 1.5 degrees. And the pink bar shows the level of risk under 2 degrees. Now I pulled this from a paper that was published recently in Nature Climate Change by Magnan et al. And they show that every additional 0.5 degree of warming, it contributes a higher global risk of human system and ecosystem deterioration. And they called for a dramatic scaling up of global action on mitigation and adaptation. Right, so in this graphic, you can see the impact on human systems on the right-hand side, or the left-hand side, sorry, impact on ecosystems and ecosystem services on that, impacts on human systems on the left, impacts on ecosystems and ecosystem services on the right. And you can look there at the impact on marine ecosystems. You know, you can see very high risk levels under both 1.5 degrees for the Arctic ecosystem, for example, also for warm water coral reefs. You know, if you look at the human systems to the left side of the circle, you'll notice the impacts on food supply, fisheries at 1.5. You know, the oceans take up about 30 to 40% of the total carbon dioxide that's emitted, and over 90% of the heat that is added to the atmosphere by human activities. But this comes at a high cost. It comes at the cost of warmer oceans, more acidic oceans, and oceans that are lower in oxygen. Okay, so if we come back to home now, it's crucial then that all sectors of the economy do their part in limiting this risk by making deep and immediate cuts to emissions to make sure that we live within the carbon budgets that were passed about 6 months ago. Now, this figure on the left-hand side, you can see on the y-axis, on the far left, the total emitted greenhouse gas emissions. On the x-axis, that is the time periods. So it covers 2006 to 2010, all the way through to 2016 to 2020. And then in the orange columns, you can see the two carbon budgets from 2021 to 2025, and then from 2026 to 2030. The orange bar that runs from left to right at the top of the figure, this shows the budgeted greenhouse gas emissions for the first carbon budget period, so for 2021 to 2025. Now, what this figure shows, in summary, are the levels of emission reductions that we need to make across Ireland's economy and society to live within the limits of both carbon budgets. It shows that the carbon budget, or the bank of greenhouse gas emissions that we have available to spend between 2021 to 2025 is about 13% smaller than what we actually spent between 2016 to 2020. Now, carbon budgets, they're an incredibly useful tool to cut emissions and to also to keep track of how well we are cutting emissions. But it also suggests that we have, carbon credits, say, left to spend, but all we have to do is look at the recent flooding in Pakistan or the drought in the Horn of Africa to realize the scale of our debt, our ecological debt, our moral debt to those in the global south. So it's just important, I suppose, to remember that while we have set these carbon budget limits, we should be aiming to live well within those limits, rather than seeing this as that we can spend all this carbon dioxide or spend all these greenhouse gas emissions. We should be aiming to spend as little as we can. Now, we are already 2.5 years into the first carbon budget. Emissions are still rising year on year. Emissions rose by about 5% in 2021. They are likely to rise again in 2022. So there's a lot of work to do to achieve the sectoral emissions reductions. And you can see these here in the table. So for example, electricity will cut by emissions by 75% by 2030, for example. And this is why we need this immediate, bold action to live within the carbon budgets. We need to make steeper cuts and far greater annual reductions to stay under budget now, because emissions have continued to increase over the last years. These cuts could potentially be up to 14% in 2023, 2024 and 2025. And this is according to recent research from UCC. Now, if emissions had peaked and started to fall last year, then we would have remained within budget with cuts of about 5% per year. Now, in 2021, emissions growth was driven by agriculture largely. This year, transport emissions are likely to be driving growth. Now, we're not building out the infrastructure that is needed to decarbonise transport quickly enough. Think about the public transport system, active travel systems such as cycling networks, and the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure for electric cars. The build-out has just been far too slow. Of all the new cars that were sold in 2022 so far, 87% run on fossil fuels. And these cars will continue to be used into the 2030s and will continue to produce emissions over that time. Now, we put forward 12 steps the government can take to cut emissions, to take these bold and immediate actions, but to cut emissions and costs across transport, buildings, electricity, agriculture and land use. And we also put forward 3 steps to drive a cultural transformation around pollution. And we will make all this information available to you. But I'll just briefly now run through some of our key asks in relation to the Climate Action Plan 2023. So in terms of transport, right, the focus there is on, providing the opportunity and the infrastructure so that people can cycle and walk to school, that they can take buses to school. Better and cheaper public transportation, electric vehicle loans for rural Ireland in particular, congestion charges in Dublin, ending the sale of new fossil fuel cars from 2026. For buildings, for example, we focused on keeping people warm, breaking our dependence on fossil fuel heating. Here you can see, right, we're calling for 100,000 homes to be insulated in 2023, again with an emphasis on those in energy poverty. Transforming social housing, get all social housing to B2, to BER B2 by 2030, and solar PV on all housing units that are feasible, that can have it by 2030, as well as banning fossil fuel boilers in new homes by 2023, for example. For electricity then, the focus was on ramping up renewables, reducing demand and guaranteeing basic needs. For example, develop 2 gigawatt of solar PV in the next 18 months. Make sure we have solar PV on all schools and 1 million homes by 2030. Also, we called for a moratorium on new data center connections until the risks are addressed as well. And then for agriculture, the focus there is on reducing chemical fertilizer use, ramping up peatland rewetting. And then in terms of the cultural transformation aspect, here we're sort of, maybe we need to start treating pollution like we treated smoking back in the day. Ban fossil fuel advertising. We need a government, long-term government-led public information campaign. And perhaps the Food Safety Authority needs to revise their healthy eating guidelines to take into account the pollution of different foods. Okay, now a quick word on COP27 before I hand over to Rosie to talk about talking to the TDs. COP27 will take place in Egypt in November. So next month, and it must close the ambition gap, and ramp up emissions reductions. Now, so far, only 2 high-emitting countries, that's Australia and Brazil, have actually submitted their updated pledge ahead of COP27. And neither of these are so far in line with that 1.5 degree goal. But as the COP27 negotiations are taking place, watch out for the discussions around what is known as the Mitigation Work Programme. This will be negotiated in Egypt, and it will identify which countries are known as major emitters. So it's likely to be contentious, but it is very important. On adaptation then, and loss and damage, there are about 3.6 billion people who are on the front line facing dangerous climate impacts. Vulnerable countries who have contributed least and who have the least capacity to respond will be hit hardest by climate change. Now, despite repeated promises to deliver climate finance at the UN climate talks over the years, the money has not been delivered. Many countries have developed adaptation plans, but most countries in the global south, they're unable to make the necessary changes without more funding. Now, recent research shows that by 2030, about 300 billion per year will be needed for adaptation. This is going to grow to about 500 billion a year by 2050 as the severity of those climate impacts increase over time. Now, in 2019, 80 billion was made available to poorer countries for both mitigation and adaptation. And for context, that's about 5 times less than what the world spends subsidizing fossil fuels every year. Now, in the Irish case, a recent analysis by Trócaire and Christian Aid, it's shown that climate finance from Ireland needs to be increased from 25 million a year by 2025 to at least 500 million. And of course, this should be in line with the needs of those countries. On loss and damage then, so the loss and damage is those climate impacts that can no longer be avoided or adapted to. Now at COP26, climate vulnerable countries pled for the creation of a new loss and damage funding facility, but their proposal was rejected by high income countries. So the can was kicked down the road to COP27. Now what we're looking for from COP27 in this regard is secure, additional and fit for purpose financing for adaptation and the development of a funding facility for loss and damage, and that Ireland supports its development and persuades other countries in the global north to also support it.
Look, we have, as you all know, over time, sent lots of e-actions to TDs, and that still has value because they still, an email from a local constituent is still something that they can't ignore, but they do get an awful lot of them that are automatically generated, so to speak, by people putting in their names and emails. So in recent times, you'll have noticed we've done a few, we did a few around the sector emission meetings where we have an e-action, and we have one from tonight, we have one running on these asks. But actually, we also suggest to people that they rewrite it themselves, or they write their own email directly to their TDs, which is definitely more powerful. But what really, 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 really amplifies either of those actions, both of those are fine, is a phone call. And whether that's a phone call, the simplest version is a phone call to the office of the TD by ringing, all this information will be available. We have it on a Google Doc we'll share with you at the end. Just ringing the door number 016183000 and asking for the office of your TD. It's only just to say, hello, I sent you an email earlier about climate action because I'm really concerned and the government has a chance for bold climate action in the next 6 weeks. Even just doing that turns what is otherwise an automatic email that will be seen, and they'll note your name, into something far more important, because a real person has rung the office to say, hello, I'm a voter in your constituency and I care about this. And you'll most likely be talking to a staffer, not to the TD. So for almost no extra work, only a little bit of extra work, and no real extra awkwardness, you can multiply the impact of sending an e-action. But then we do also want to invite you to think about, look, do I actually want to ask to talk to the TD if possible? Just myself, first of all, by phone, but as in just yourself by phone. And then the other thing, we'll hold out and we'll do some checking in on this with people tonight and beyond. Do a few of you want, if there are a few of you who are connected already, for example, in WhatsApp groups through the One Future network, or otherwise in other groups, do you want to ask TDs if you're going to phone up? Do you want to ask, could he or she meet 3 or 4 of you together to talk about this? And of course, the ultimate action is you or a few others actually going into a constituency clinic mostly on Friday or Saturday or Monday to talk to the TD in person, or to arrange to ring the constituency office and arrange to meet them. So that's just it's a spectrum of how this could happen. And while it would be fantastic to meet them in person, the really big sort of shift, the marginal gain is from just sending an email to ringing up. That makes it far more powerful. So, but because we're going to ask you to think about actually talking to them, let's say whether that's by phone or by email, we dug out some tips that we produced. We have 2 versions of this. Can I share my screen, Rosie? Because I have the slightly longer version that's more polite.
Sure, yeah.
If I can just find it 1 second, just make sure I have the right screen showing. we did say, here we go, yeah. Back in the days when we used to do face-to-face mass lobbies through Stop Climate Case, both Stop Climate Case itself and Ukra, one of the founding members of Stop Climate Case, produced tips for talking to your TDs. And the reason we're going to show you these now is because we're going to suggest that we break into groups and actually practice. We're going to give you the 12-point plan, which we've talked a bit about. We'll give you the link to that. I think Rosie's put it in the chat, and ask you to spend like 3 minutes each, as if you were talking to your TD, to say, well, what would you be saying? And our overall takeaway, like the thing that really matters is just, you know, we've waited this long to take big action. We need only bold action will do now, not small incremental steps. We need bold action. It's an emergency. We need the government to act like it's an emergency, the way we did for COVID, for example. That scale of response. That's actually all. That's the overarching message. And you can say, if you don't say no more detail, you can say, and I support the 12 steps, the 12-step program for bold climate action that Friends of the Earth has put out. That's all you need to say, in a way. It's just we need to get across to as many TDs as possible that scale and urgency is what's required here, not just tinkering around the edges. And the more people who say that to them, the better. If you want to get into detail, then you can. And if you are having a longer conversation with them, some of the things that Ukra and Stop Climate Case have suggested. Prepare, know a little bit about them, choose which points you're going to make, because you won't have, you know, if you're meeting them in person or on a phone call, it'll be 5 minutes max. And I'm going to do these slightly out of order. You know a little bit about them is useful, like what party are they in, what political grouping if they're in, are they in, and where that party's at, and these things. A little bit of research could be useful. It doesn't, not essential, but useful just to know, are they government or opposition? And of course, because it's Ireland, it says obviously to be polite and friendly. But here also too, it says emphasise the locals. So they'll do this to you. They'll want to know. You know, they'll want to make. Are you the Smiths from the Murphys from Clonmel or Cashel or whatever? They'll want to make those connections. They always do in our experience. And the really important thing to remember is that they are generalists, however little you think you might know. And obviously, in fact, you're here tonight and you've probably been involved in Friends of the Earth or Stop Climate Case or one future activities over a year or more, far more. You will know as much about this, about the general stuff on climate as they will, if not a lot more. They're not experts, they're generalists. You don't have to be an expert. You are a constituent raising your concerns with your elected representative saying, I want you to push the government for climate action that meets the moment, that's bold enough to put us in the right direction, and to be concise, unlike me, and stay on point as much as possible. And then the issue of be clear in what you're asking for. So if are you asking them to write to the minister, or if they're in the same party as Minister Eamon Ryan, or if they're Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, if they can easily contact them because they're in government, like you can talk about what the government needs to do. But basically, it doesn't really matter what party they're in or what political party they're in. We want them to be talking to their, we want them to raise it in their parliamentary party meetings. We want them to raise it with their spokesperson on climate action, if they have a spokesperson, if they're not just an independent, if they have any of the parties have someone who's a spokesperson on climate action, they can raise it with that spokesperson. Hey, I'm getting calls about this. My voters want big action in the new plan. If we can have, if the spokesperson in all the parties is getting TDs in the next 5 weeks saying, hey, I'm getting a couple of calls about this, that will mean, okay, people are paying attention to whether this action plan is up to speed. That will put pressure on the government, but it'll also make the opposition pay more attention and put more time into it. So the more specific we can be about the asks, and again, we'll have guidance on that for you. But not just the ask in terms of the policy ask, but what we want the TD to do, because he's not right. He or she is not actually writing the policy, but we want them to talk to the minister if they can, to raise it in the Dáil and to raise it in their political grouping, or talk to their spokesperson. That's the kind of things we want them to do. And if you are meeting them in person, obviously take a photograph and share it on social media, and maybe you can write an email to follow up. And the one other thing I was going to say here was, the strength in numbers. So it's fab to do this on your own by phone, or even by Zoom. But obviously there's a benefit and a strength in doing it as a group. And we'll try to support those of you who I know one person on the chat saying there's a couple of them in the same area. Could they do something together? And that's definitely worthwhile exploring. If there are a few of you who are in a One Future WhatsApp group, or in an existing group somewhere else in Ireland, and you want to do this together,